What do I mean by that? Sometimes the Gospels, Paul, Acts, Peter, assume that you know what's going on in the larger world for you to understand the conversation that they're having. They don't always stop to say, okay, let me tell you what's happening out here. We had this discussion. Now we're having some inside conversation. That's why sometimes, like the letters, Peter, James, Paul, can be hard to understand because a lot of their conversation is inside conversation between two people, okay? So they've already had a conversation, and now you're peeking into part of that conversation, okay? Understanding the first century world helps us to gather information about that conversation, okay? I'll give you some examples from the New Testament, or one example that I love. When we get into the book of Matthew, we get into John's baptism, all of a sudden you hear this group of the Pharisees and the Sadducees out of nowhere, okay?
Out of nowhere, yeah,
why are they out of nowhere? Are there any Pharisees and Sadducees in the Old Testament? No. Do the gospel writers ever stop and tell you, okay, since you don't know these guys because you just finished reading Malachi, now we're in Matthew, let me stop and tell you who these guys are because you've never heard of them before? Never. He assumes that you know who the Pharisees and Sadducees are because in the mind of Matthew, not so much in the mind of God, because let's say the New Testament is for us as well, 2018, but in the mind of Matthew, he's writing to a first century audience. So he knows these guys know who that is, okay? In Luke 4, Jesus goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, very famous story we all know, even if you don't read the New Testament a lot, where Jesus quotes from Isaiah 61. He says, this text is fulfilled before your eyes. He is in a synagogue, okay? Not a church. Churches did not exist at the time. How many of us know what happens in the first century synagogue? Most of us don't know what happens in the first century synagogue, okay? Some of it is related to what happens in a synagogue now, but as you said, things have changed dramatically in 2,000 plus years. But Luke, the gospel writer, doesn't stop and say, hey, since you are living in New York City in the 5 boroughs, let me tell you what happened in the first century synagogue. He assumes that as Jesus sits and stands and reads from Isaiah, from the scroll of Isaiah, because we don't have books yet, we have scrolls, he assumes that you know what's happening. Why is Jesus standing? Well, Jesus is standing because in the synagogue in the first century, you stand to read from the Bible.
Bible, yep.
Okay? You don't do that, and when I'm referring to Bible, I mean the first 5 books there. When you read from other parts of the Bible, you don't necessarily have to stand up in a first century synagogue. So when it says, and Jesus stood and took the scroll and they gave him the scroll of Isaiah, it assumes that he also read from somewhere in the 5 books, Genesis to Deuteronomy. Those are the things that you uncover when you start understanding something in the first century world. So today, we are going to talk briefly about the Nativity, okay? But first, I need some of your input, okay? When you think of the Nativity, this is the birth of Jesus, okay? Most of our churches will have nativity scenes in the front. What elements, some of it is on the screen, what elements exist in that nativity? Yes?
Manger.
Okay, you have a manger.
Baby Jesus.
Baby Jesus is definitely needed.
Star.
Moses and Mary?
I think you mean Joseph and Mary.
Joseph, sorry.
Moses was a little bit dead.
It's all good, man. It's all good.
Okay, what else?
Animals.
Livestock.
Okay, livestock. That's good because the manger is what? You know the word trough?
A trough, yeah.
Where the animals feed.
The shepherds.
There's a manger, you're going to have animals. Okay? Otherwise, you wasted money on the manger.
Yeah, the
Okay?
wise men.
What else? We have at some point, we have the Magi, what we commonly call the wise men. How many are there?
3.
So they say.
So they say.
Hey.
Matthew does not tell us the number of the Magi.
Exactly.
The three Magi happened about 150 years after the New Testament is written, and it's probably related to the fact they gave 3 gifts.
Right.
Okay? But 3 gifts don't assume 3 people.
It's like
Why?
300 people.
Because if my wife and I go to your house party, your housewarming party, you're only getting 1 gift from us.
Yo, I'm going to get 3 gifts. I'm going to invite you.
one.
I'm going to invite you 3 gifts.
Okay.
I'm going to invite you right now.
There may have been 3, there may have been 4, there may have been 5, there may have been 6. Okay? This is not time to stop celebrating the 3 Kings Day. You celebrate that. This is just maybe you want to think about expanding what you know about the nativity scene. Okay, what else? What does traditionally the structure look like?
Hay.
Stable.
So it's a stable.
A barn.
A barn. Look like a barn.
There was
A
hay in the
stable, a
barn.
barn made of what?
Wood.
Made of wood.
There's hay in the barn.
Of course. Hay. Okay. Now what happens when Mary's pregnant and they get to Bethlehem? What happens as part of our story? She goes into labor and then
They go to the inn.
And there's no room.
they go to the inn and there's no room.
She's probably angry at Joseph.
I'm not breaking up happy. There's no room in the inn, as our traditional story tells us, so they are forced to go to, as you say, a stable barn that's made out of wood and has hay in it, and animals and livestock and all this other stuff. Okay? Now, a couple of things that we're going to work through here very quickly with some images on the board as well. This word here is in question. Okay? Where we get this story from, and sometimes, if you remember, some of the stories are that they go, and not only is there no room at the inn, but also they have an angry innkeeper.
Yeah.
Okay? Sometimes that's part of the story. The innkeeper. That's not in every story, but he appears in some.
I remember that.
Okay?
Yeah.
Slams the door, he's a
Yeah.
little rude. They're forced to go out to the barn where he's born away from family, essentially alone until the shepherds show up and then the magi, so on and so forth. Okay, so Jesus alone, he's not connected with family. I'm going to suggest to you, when you know this story in a first century context, that it changes a lot of that. Okay, the first is, and this is just reading the Bible, which is important, is the text that we build this story off of. It comes out of Luke 2. Okay? I'm going to read it here fairly quickly. Luke 2, 1 through 7. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. This was the first enrollment when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be enrolled, each in his own city, which is why Joseph has to go to Bethlehem. And Joseph also went up from the Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house of the lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, or who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to be delivered. She gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the, and let's put in quotation, a question mark around in, okay? The Greek word you don't have to worry about too much is kataluma. Okay? Now, what is missing from this story?
The innkeeper.
The angry innkeeper.
No innkeeper. Okay? We do have an innkeeper later in the Gospel of Luke, in the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
The Good Samaritan takes the injured person to an inn, which means that that's a place that you pay to stay, and offers the innkeeper more money or whatever he's going to owe for the injured party to stay there. Okay, so there we have an innkeeper. Okay? Now, a couple of things. Joseph is called to return to his city. Why? Because it's going to be a census. Okay? Census is a Roman way of trying to see how much everyone's going to get taxed. Okay? So, as the line was once said in the movie, you can't tax zero. So, if Joseph is returning to Bethlehem, it means that he is owner or part owner of some property. Likely. He has something.
Oh, that's good.
Okay? Now, we're not saying Joseph is wealthy. We're not saying he's, going crazy in Nazareth buying everything. But he has to go to Bethlehem to be counted because he has some responsibility, which means that he's not at zero. There's something there of value that will be taxed by the Roman Empire. So he goes, and likely other family members are going to go, which means what? That he has family in Bethlehem.
They're not alone. Yeah.
Okay? He's not alone. He has family members. Now, our story tells us that Mary's given birth, okay? Mary's goes into labor right when they get to Bethlehem. That's usually the story, because then they're looking for an innkeeper. Innkeeper's like, no, I'm sold out. Barn. Okay?
Barn.
That's usually
Barn.
the story goes.
Get out.
Barn. But look at what it says in Luke. And while they were there, it doesn't say when they got there. It says while they were there, which means they were already there for a little while. We don't know how long that while is, 1, 2 days, whatever. But it wasn't a rush to an inn, okay? Why wouldn't it be a rush to an inn? If Joseph has family there, and Joseph is going to be counted to the census, where is Joseph's first stop?
Yeah. It's family. It's
Why
family.
not? Okay? Now, at the time that they're there, then she goes to be delivered. By the way, complete sidebar. When they leave Nazareth, they're just fiancés. When they get to Bethlehem, they're married because they apparently begin to live together. In ancient Judaism, you couldn't do it without being married. You couldn't cohabitate or live together without being married. So somewhere in this text, they get married, but we don't have the story. Likely in the first century, their marriage would have been a multi-day affair, but we don't have that story, unfortunately. But somewhere between Nazareth and Bethlehem, maybe while they were in Bethlehem, there was a marriage, okay? Now, the interesting thing, when we bring this sort of into the first century, it says that they were in a manger. There was no place in the inn, and we'll talk about that word in a moment, but it makes it seem like they were born separate from everybody else. And this begins to lead us into a conversation about how did people live in the first century, okay?
It's good.
Here's a picture. No, you don't want that guy. He's not in the text. This is the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, in Israel. By the way, we give our students to do a number of trips around the world, and one of our trips that I participate on is the trip to Israel.
Israel, yeah.
Okay? I do about 3 or 4 of them a year, not for night, but I do about 3 or 4 tours a year. The Church of the Nativity is the traditional place where Jesus was born. It is the oldest continuously running church in the world. It's existed as a church since the 4th century, since the 4th century. Now what you see here is what you expect of like a Catholic church or an Orthodox church. There are tapestries and lamps and all this other stuff, okay? But there's one thing I want you to notice. See the steps going down? Okay? When you enter the church, you enter above this. You have to go down to the place where Jesus was born. If you were to strip all this hundreds, thousands of years of church history, tapestries, lamps, whatever, paving stones, all you will have is a stone cave.
Like a basement, yeah.
Okay? A stone cave.
Wow.
That stone cave would have been part of a home. Probably a basement. Sometimes it is the major part of the home. In this case, it would have been attached to a home. Okay? Don't think Flintstones. In the first century, depending on where you lived, if you lived in Nazareth, if you lived in Bethlehem, there were large cave systems. And the cave systems were then furnished to be lived in. Okay? They provided protection from the sun because usually they were made out of limestone, which remains cool. And in the winter, there was something else that kept them warm, which we'll get to. A better picture of these homes is under the church at Nazareth. Okay, the city of Joseph where Jesus is continuing to be raised. Above this is a church, the Church of the Annunciation, which remembers the place where Gabriel came to Mary to tell her she would be with child.
She was a child, yeah.
Okay? It is the largest church in the Middle East, and there are still Arab Christians there that go to church. Okay, despite the fact it's the largest Arab Muslim city in Israel. Okay? Now that's one of the things you learn when you go to Israel is that every time, because the Catholic Church was the first people to get there, so, or actually the Armenians were there first, but let's just say wherever there was a holy site, church. Okay, so every time we go to a holy site where something happened in the life of Jesus, we often find the church, okay? But under the church, what they did was preserve these caves. This is the back of the house, let's say, or we're looking into the basement, let's say, potentially, okay? All along under the church are these cave systems, okay? So you have to think, maybe at the bottom here, you're gonna have your agricultural tools, okay, on one side. You're gonna have what's called a hearth, which is your clay oven that you're gonna do cooking, okay? And then let's say up here, for example's sake, it's sort of rough. This is going to be sort of the room where people will sleep It could be an additional room. It would have been furnished with carpets and pillows. It would have probably had wood, but as you know, wood over time disintegrates, okay?
Yeah.
It would have had a thatched roof, okay? Now here's the thing with the story in the Gospels. We can go back for a second. One of the things that a family does in the first century, you will still find Palestinian homes doing this, is that when you find out your child is getting married or your son is getting married, in the West here, what do we do with our kids? We go, okay, now you move out with your family, start your family. Don't move very far away, but you can't live here. Okay, you go do your thing, and we'll visit each other once in a while.
Across
okay?
the street.
Exactly. In the East, you add on to your house because your son is expected to move in with his wife. So often you will find homes that look like this. I remember when I first went to Israel, it was the strangest thing. You have a home. Then you have bars, right? Rebar that helps support the cement, the concrete. And you go, what's wrong with these homes? They don't look finished, okay? The reason the rebar is there is that when they need to add on to the home, it makes it much easier to add on to the home.
Rebar, yeah.
So you add on for the family to move in. So now let's apply that first century style to the story. If Joseph returns home, okay, to where he was from, Bethlehem, and his family hears somehow that he's coming with Mary and she's pregnant, what are they going to begin to do?
Fill the home,
They're
yeah.
going to begin to build a home.
Build it.
Okay? They're going to begin to build a home. Now in Greek, what might you call that place they were going to stay, that room?
Kataluma.
Okay? When it says there was no room, it is better to translate there was no room in the room they were going to stay. Okay? Which means what? That the room that the family had prepared likely for them, there was no room for her to go into labor, and they had to find another place. So you say, okay, they went outside to find the bar. Let's hold on for a second. The first thing is, at any point in history, a woman giving birth is exceptionally dangerous, even in 2019. Okay? My daughter gave birth. She had multiple complications during her first child. Okay, imagine the first century when science was very rudimentary, very at its beginning stages, okay, extremely dangerous. So you probably would have, if she gave birth, if she was, going into labor, you would probably have people from the community come in, especially midwives, because they knew the ins and outs of giving birth. They could maybe see if there was something dangerous happening, okay? So you're probably going to have a lot of people join the house, okay? People want to see what's going on. There's an addition being added to this community. God is bringing a child into the world, okay? We want to be there to see this. The midwives are worried that Mary's going to be okay and make it through this, okay? Because thousands upon thousands of women died in the ancient period giving birth. I mean, that happens today too, but we're not talking about today. This is an exceptionally dangerous thing, okay? So whatever room they built, and again, this is sort of building out the text with what we know about the first century. Let's say that the room that they built was made for Joseph, Mary, and child. So to start bringing all those people together, okay, we're filling up the room. There's no room in the room that we made. So where do we go? Often in the bottom of the home, where the cave portion was, one of the things that you would do that we don't do now, and I don't think we even do it in the Midwest, is that you would keep your livestock in the house with you. Okay? Remember I told you that I didn't name what provided warmth during the cold months? It would be the animals. Okay, now I understand you think about keeping a sheep and a cow in your house. You can imagine the kind of smell.
Not in the Bronx, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. But that was something first century people did, okay? You already know a story that has this in it, although they don't explicitly mention it. You know the story of Jephthah in Judges? When he's fighting the Ammonites, and he makes a vow to God saying, if you let me defeat the Ammonites, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out my door. What comes out of his door? His daughter singing his victory. What did he expect if he lives like this?
An animal.
He expected an animal to come out. But they never tell you that in the story, because they assume that you know that people in the Israelite period had livestock in the house. Okay? In this story, it's the same. Okay? If you have animals living in the house with you, what do you need to feed them?
Trough.
Mangers, troughs.
Yeah, troughs. Yeah.
Okay? You need mangers and troughs. This is probably going to be the biggest part of your house. So in a cave like this, you would probably have mangers splitting up the animals and all of your stuff, because you don't want the animals chewing. If you have goats, they eat everything. Okay, so you don't want them messing with your clay oven. You don't want them messing with whatever's on that side. So you have mangers. So what happens? When the room is full, where do we go? Let's go to the biggest part of the house, where we can fit the midwives, we can fit Mary, make sure everything's okay. And then what's the thing that's most crib-like in that part of the house?
The trough, the manger.
This is an ancient stone manger. Now I know people who have kids are thinking, I'm not putting my baby in that. This is the closest thing. Now probably would have had hay, probably would have been more comfortable. This is the closest thing you get to a crib in the first century. Okay? This is a stone manger from the first century. This would have been in any person's house in the first century.
Wow.
Okay? So now that we have that context, what else does that tell us? That tells us that Jesus wasn't born apart from family. Now, of course, the Magi come and the shepherds come, and that's all important. But it also means that when Jesus was born, he was born right with Joseph's family. Everyone was there to witness this event of the Messiah coming into the world. Okay? It's one of those things where we sort of sometimes separate Jesus from his culture, and when we read the New Testament, it's important to bring him back into his culture. Because we experience ourselves being from different cultures that God works in our culture.
Amen.
It's the same thing in the first century. God incarnated into someone that was a first century Jew. Okay? Therefore, him being a first century Jew in the same way me being a 2019 Puerto Rican is important to who we are and how we understand each other. Right?
Amen.
Okay? So the same thing for Jesus. Even his birth, when read in the first century context, we see that he is that it changes the text a little. Actually, let me not say that because that sounds wrong. It doesn't change the text. It actually, because the text is not changed at all, but it helps to color the text. It helps to add almost a 3D effect to the text.
That's right.
Because now you're seeing the room.
That's right.
Now you're seeing the manger. Now you're seeing how a first century home is configured, and it tells you the story, I think, as Luke expected you to read it. Okay? Any questions?
Great.
Anything. You're welcome to ask now. Or maybe you've seen in the fall.
Changing the
3
Nativity
weeks from
scene.
now. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to say, how about them Mets this year?
No.
Oh.
Oh, don't talk about that. In my class, there's strictly Yankees, Giants.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, listen, I suffer a lot. But being a Yankees fan helps to alleviate that pain.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So now with the context, now I'm thinking now of when like they took the paralytic man up. Now that I know the structure of what actually it looks like, I'm thinking they went through the roof. Did they actually meet all in the basement then? And then they like tunneled?
Well, the structure of that home would have been different.
Is it different? Okay.
Because that was in Capernaum.
So they had a totally different structure.
So in
Okay.
Capernaum, they don't have a cave system because Capernaum is by the Lake of Galilee. It's right on the shores of fishing village. So what they probably had were insula homes. Okay, this is an insula home. You have a central courtyard, and then you have homes around the side. So this was usually for an extended family. So when Peter speaks about his mother-in-law being sick, okay, let's say that Peter's house is here, but then his mother-in-law lives here, and then they share a central courtyard. And this also is built out of stone, because when you go to Israel now, you see a lot of trees, but a lot of that has been planted by a later fund.
Oh, wow.
In the first century, you build with what you have,
Wow.
and what you have in Israel is a lot of rocks.
They're all rocks, yeah.
A lot of rocks. So this is built out of stone, but people live together. When Jesus says, I go away, my Father has many, and we talk about mansions, it's actually probably better translated as rooms.
Yeah.
Because this is the image that he's working with.
It's awesome.
He's talking about a home where each person that is with him lives together and shares together.
Oh, it's awesome.
Like they did back then.
Like they did
Yeah.
back then.
Wow.
The question
Yeah.
It's
about
great.
the midwives now with science and education about like the medical field or whatever being pretty much non-existent back then, how did they know what to do in terms of delivering the child, and what was their success rate, basically?
the success rate would be very difficult to. It would be a guess, at best, because that includes texts that we read from ancient history, as well as, you know, the finding of bones archaeologically. That's a very difficult thing. My assumption is that they would know from experience. That midwives, after they had numerous experience with pregnancies, they would start to know the ins and outs. Again, they can't know everything. It's like now, you know, for instance, if someone starts hemorrhaging while they're giving birth, there's a medication they can give them. They know how to stop it. In the first century, that would have been more difficult. So what they know is still very rudimentary, right? But what they know is probably from the continual giving birth of women giving birth. In particular in ancient Judaism, because one of these ancient Judaisms is that you would be fruitful and multiply. And in the first century, you don't have any birth control, any of that. So women are getting pregnant. So you get all shades. You know, if you've been there while a woman's giving birth 10 times in the first century, you're probably going to get all shades of what can go wrong and what can go right.
Yeah, the experience.
And what you try to do to stop, you know, a problem happening versus when everything's going well. But I would say that there was a very high rate of mortality in terms of women and in terms of babies as well. I mean, there's a high rate of mortality now.
It is, yeah.
That happens now. It's exceptionally dangerous thing. I mean, as a man, I didn't realize it for years because I've never had that experience. But when my daughter started giving birth, she started hemorrhaging right after. And she was close to. So, and then I realized, oh my goodness, this is not like a random thing here. This is a thing that can happen all the time and happens frequently. So in the first century, you're probably going to have, as we do now, you know, when you give birth, people come and visit you, bring you balloons and all stuff. It's a community event.
Yeah.
Someone's being added, someone precious is being added to your family, to your extended family. So same thing in the first century. But midwives in particular would have been an important part of that process. We have midwives going all the way back to Moses.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Because science and education about the medical field was pretty much non-existent.
Yeah.
So I mean, everybody was born probably, you know, from a midwife back in them days, you know.
In the house.
Yeah.
If it was in the house, then it would have been family would have been there that obviously would have experienced.
Yeah, you would have family there. You probably would have midwives. Who knows if there's midwives within the family.
Yeah, so.
But yeah, often in the East, one of the big things when it comes to families growing, this is true of Jesus as well, is that community's an important thing. Like in the West, you can live part of a community. Like here in New York, you can live part of a community, but you can also live by yourself without the community. In the East and in the ancient period, life is so rough that you can't afford to only be on your own.
Wow.
So people in Nazareth are going to know who Jesus and his family is. Like when he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, they say, isn't this Joseph's son?
Yeah.
They know who he is already.
It is, yeah.
Okay? It's the same thing with every other community. And that's one of the things that we try to do in my New Testament classes. We try to show that when you move the picture of the Bible to the East versus the West, especially in ancient times, our picture of what's going on changes,
Really changes,
significantly.
It's really
Okay.
good.
Any other questions?
So, in this particular area where this took place, in Bethlehem, it was said in, I believe, the book of Luke we were reading from, that this was the area where the tribe of Judah was.
Yeah.
So, was the 12 tribes still a lot of different lands?
No, by the time of the first century, there are no more 12 tribes. There's the area of Judea, which is Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and its surrounding areas. And then as you work your way north, you have Samaria and then the Galilee.
And the Galilees, yeah.
Okay, so it's Galilee, Samaria, Judea. However, just like that, north to south.
It's all
Okay?
segregated. Yeah.
However, people would still understand themselves to belong to particular tribes. Okay, so we have evidence in the Second Temple of people, not only certain tribes, but people aligning themselves with, say, the house of David. Understanding that they came from the house of David. The priests would understand what tribe they came from. So people understood it, but there were no more tribes.
Wow.
There were no more tribes in terms of, you know, the 12 that we know from the Old Testament.
Okay, so like the allotments of land no longer existed after that?
No.
Was it because of the rule of Rome, or?
Well, partly was first because of the destruction of the Assyrian Empire in 722 in the Old Testament. They destroyed the 10 in the north,
Yeah.
and then when Babylon comes, they end the 2 in the south.
Yeah.
So they're done.
They destroyed all.
When they come back, which is detailed like in the Book of Chronicles, in Nehemiah and Ezra, these books, they're trying to rebuild a nation, but now they have to rebuild it under the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. So that changed everything up.
Okay, so since there's no more tribes, were there still priests
Yes.
that were appointed from the Levitical priesthood then?
There were priests that were attempted to be assigned from the Levitical priesthood. It's a larger conversation. Because they go away to Babylon for so many years, there's a break in what's happening in Israel. Okay? So when they come back, figuring out whose priest bloodline is what becomes a challenge. Becomes a challenge. But the priests in the Second Temple period were believed to have been descended at least from Zadok, who was the high priest during the days of Solomon. So they believed to be themselves of the Levite tribe.
Wow.
Can they prove that with blood tests? No, they cannot prove that with blood tests.
All right, because
They're doing that based off tradition that they
They
have.
had to use the urine and the thummim?
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
That's very cool.
Because the Jews that I work with, I asked them the question, do you know what tribe you descended from, like Reuben, Simeon, Levi,
Right.
Judah? They was like, no, we're all children of Jacob.
Right.
They don't say that they're from Reuben, Simeon. And I thought that they might know the answer to that, but I guess
Sometimes the only ones that can say that they're from the tribe of Levi are actually people whose last name is Levi or Levi, or people's last names Cohen or Cohen. Kohen in Hebrew means priest. So these individuals might say that they come from priestly lineage, which come out of the Levitical tribe.
Wow.
But yeah, that's not it's not really I mean, there's no way you can tell anyway. It's not like you took a DNA test. You go back to Dan or whatever tribe you want to go
I'm
to.
royalty.
It's impossible. Anybody else?
That's awesome.
Okay, I think we're done. Although they seem like they're giving me more time. So let me just check real quick.
Yo, my mind is blown right now. Yo, I'm not gonna set up the nativity scene. I'm about to do a hole in the ground. Then my wife's gonna be mad at me for digging a hole in the ground.
He knows so much about the Bible, and he's just serious about it.
Yeah. My mind has just been blown. What about you guys?
I had to,
The truth shall set you free. No more. Yeah. I was mind blown, right, guys? Amazing. Jesus is the way, the truth. Amazing, guys. Amazing. And Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
When you was speaking about Jeff, I never understood why he sent his daughter out there first. So that just like cleared up everything. I'm saying, why would his daughter be the first one out there?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why they begin to mourn.
He's trying to game the
They
game.
begin to mourn because they're concerned that I mean that time there's no other people sacrifice children, but it was forbidden for the Israelites to do so. So that was child and offering an altar. This is not something you do. There is a question that scholars have asked, because if you actually read the story, Jephthah never explicitly sacrifices her. He just sends her away to the area of the tabernacle.
Yeah.
So there's a question as to whether the reason they were mourning was because she was sacrificed, or she was sent to the
Sent away.
tabernacle and remained a virgin for the rest of her life, dedicated to the tabernacle and not having any children. Because in ancient Israel, having a descendancy was extremely valuable.
It's huge, yeah.
It was a huge thing. Okay, thank you guys for listening. I think you can go back to the room you were in. See the other classes.
Amazing. Amazing.